A strip of cold light cuts across his grin as he leans closer, whispering something he shouldn't enjoy. And for a moment, I'm not sure if it's the flickering bulb overhead or the way his mouth tilts that makes the entire room feel slightly warped. I stand perfectly still, because stillness is the only thing I have left that he can't twist into something else, and the faint flutter of the light keeps catching on the sharp edge of his teeth, as if even the electricity knows better than to stay steady around him. The office feels unnaturally quiet at this hour, the kind of quiet that exposes every shallow breath, every subtle shift of weight, every threat dressed up as casual conversation. His whisper isn't loud, but it lands with a weight that pulls the air inward, tightening everything around us. The flickering bulb hums, struggling against itself, sending uneven pulses across the white walls and making the shadows stretch and recoil like they're trying to escape the moment too. I can smell the faint metallic tang of overheated wiring, or maybe that's just the taste of my own fear rising again, the kind that slides in beneath memory and disrupts everything it touches. I keep my voice locked behind my teeth because any sound I make feels like it would give him something: permission, invitation, victory, and none of those belong to him. He leans closer still, pretending he's only making a joke, pretending his grin is harmless, pretending this is just another moment in an office lit by too many fluorescent lies. The strip of cold white light cuts a second time across his face, slicing the grin into something harder to read, and I feel my pulse climb even though my body doesn't move. I watch the way the brightness fractures over his jawline, how the bulb's hesitation creates its own rhythm, a rhythm that syncs perfectly with the dread curling down my spine. It's strange how cruelty can sound soft when someone is practiced at it. He speaks low enough that anyone passing might think he's sharing a secret. But secrets require trust, and whatever he thinks he's doing is something colder. I sense the shift in his tone before he even finishes the whisper, that faint tilt into mockery that only I seem to hear clearly. He likes pretending he knows me. He likes pretending he can measure the limits of my silence. He likes thinking he has found the seam in me, where grief and quiet meet the place he can dig his words into. I can't let myself react. Not yet. Not here. Not now. The uneven glow from the flickering bulb draws a trembling halo around the two of us, and in that moment it almost feels like the truth is trapped in the air, waiting for the right pulse of light to reveal itself. I stare at the far wall because if I keep looking at him, I might not be able to hide the way his whisper lands in the softest, most unprotected part of me. Something cold tries to settle inside my chest, something that feels like the first crack forming in a place I've worked too hard to keep whole. I swallow it back. I try to remember the last time my heart didn't feel like it was bracing for impact. The office around us hums the machines dormant, but not asleep, the quiet full of small threats and unspoken boundaries. He pulls back slightly enough to make it look like nothing happened, but there's a flicker in his eye that tells me he knows he crossed another line. The flickering bulb seems to agree, sputtering harder, as if trying to illuminate the part of him he keeps shaded. I don't move, but inside something shifts, a decision forming at the edges of where fear and exhaustion have lived for too long. Shadows twitch along the wall behind him, as if trying to warn me before the moment becomes too sharp to ignore. The light stutters across his grin again, revealing how much he enjoys watching me pretend this doesn't hurt. He steps back just enough for the illusion of space to return, and I feel a strange calm settle into me, the kind that doesn't erase fear, but rearranges it into something steadier. No one else is here. No witnesses, no allies, no accidental saviors, just him, the bulb, and the cold weight of the present pressing hard against my ribs. The silence thickens after his whisper fades, and I can feel the truth of it clinging to my skin, insisting that whatever brought us to this exact moment started long before tonight. Something in the flickering light tells me this is only the beginning of what he's willing to cross. Her breath slow, steady, watching the grin flicker. The light breaks again, sharper this time, slicing the moment open. I didn't realize how much that moment under the flickering bulb would come to define everything that followed. But months earlier, when all of this was still building beneath the surface, my days felt routine in a way that disguised just how fragile the balance truly was. I'm Lena Hart, 33, a project coordinator from Denver, Colorado, and that morning I pushed through the office door without a single thought about danger or humiliation or the way grief can make you a quieter version of yourself. The cold doorknob bit against my palm the moment I twisted it, a tiny shock of chill that made me shiver, though the building's heating system was humming normally. I told myself it was nothing, just leftover winter air clinging to the metal, and I stepped inside with the same tight little smile I'd practiced since my mother's passing, a smile meant to reassure everyone that I was functioning, stable, manageable. The hallway lights buzzed faintly as always, but something in the way they trembled made me pause. That was when I first noticed the motif that wouldn't stop echoing through the weeks to come. A thin shadow splits across the hallway floor. The shadow came from the metal ridge under the exit sign, but it felt symbolic, like a reminder that even the simplest light could fracture into pieces. I walked into the main office, nodding to two coworkers who were whispering in low tones that stopped the moment they saw me. Their smiles were too quick, too carefully rearranged. A faint pressure built behind my ribs, the kind that warns you something is off before your mind can name it. I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and tried to swallow that feeling, but Mark's glance caught me from across the room, sharp and quick, like he'd been waiting for me to look up so he could evaluate whatever expression I carried today. I hated that he'd become accustomed to reading me at all. He smirked just slightly, like he'd overheard a joke no one else was in on, and returned his attention to the stack of reports on his desk. The moment stung more than it should have. I busied myself with emails, clicking through subject lines that blurred together. My mother's name came up in one of the autofill fields for a moment, her old contact still saved in my synced account, and I fought the urge to delete it. I wasn't ready for that finality. I closed the window instead, hoping no one saw the tremor in my hand. The morning passed slowly each hour, thinning my patience a little more. Coworkers moved around me with the kind of polite distance reserved for someone grieving, someone unpredictable, someone they didn't want to accidentally trigger. It made me feel simultaneously watched and ignored. Maya drifted by my desk with her usual soft-spoken greeting, but she hesitated before speaking, as if she'd almost said something else entirely. Mark, meanwhile, strolled through the aisle twice, just to make sure I knew he was there, his presence always too loud even when he didn't say a word. I tried to stay in my routine, tried to keep the motions clean and controlled, emails, spreadsheets, polite smiles. But grief has a way of warping even the simplest tasks, and I felt like I was moving through someone else's life, wearing someone else's skin, trying not to let any seams show. Every time I glimpsed the thin shadow from the hallway in my memory, the sense of unease returned. It felt like something was quietly positioning itself around me, tightening its hold while pretending nothing had changed. At lunch, the office kitchen was filled with the smell of microwaved leftovers and forced optimism. Mark stood near the coffee machine, joking with two colleagues, and they laughed a second too late each time he spoke, as though they weren't sure whether they were supposed to. The moment his eyes slid to me, the laughter died. He smiled, the same rehearsed expression he always used when he wanted to seem harmless. But I felt something hidden beneath it, something he hadn't shown yet but clearly wanted to. I turned away, pretending my stomach wasn't coiling tight. By mid-afternoon my nerves were raw, but the day offered no explanation for their fraying. Mark hadn't said anything overtly inappropriate that morning, hadn't crossed any visible lines, hadn't mocked my mother the way he would later. But he moved with an intent that felt like a shadow, always there, always waiting. Maya hovered again near my desk, looking like she wanted to warn me about something but couldn't. The office felt full of thin cracks, quiet fractures, no one acknowledged. When it was finally time to leave, I reached for the same cold doorknob I'd touched that morning, and the chill felt sharper, as if the metal remembered something I didn't. For the first time I sensed that whatever was coming had already begun long before I noticed it. I walked out into the fading daylight, with one thought beating through me. The quiet was about to break. A tension I couldn't name trailed me all the way home. When I arrived the next morning, the office felt heavier than it had any right to, as if the stale air from the weekend had settled into the walls and refused to leave. I tried to brush off the unease, telling myself I was overthinking things, but the feeling clung to me like dust caught in static. I set my bag down, pulled out my phone, and that was when I saw it. The cracked phone reflection splitting my own face into uneven shards, and behind me catching Mark in the glass with an angle so distorted it made him look like he occupied two different spaces at once. For a second I couldn't breathe. I angled the phone slightly to see if it was just my imagination, but even through the fracture I could tell he was watching me, his expression unreadable in the divided shapes. I turned the screen downward before he could notice how startled I was. He walked past moments later, close enough that I could smell the faint citrus of his cologne, but far enough that he didn't have to acknowledge the tension simmering under the surface. There was a hardness in the way he moved that morning, a sharpness in his posture that made the office lights seem too bright. I tried to steady my breathing as I opened my laptop, hoping the rhythm of task lists and emails would settle my mind. It didn't. The reflection kept replaying in my memory, his face in pieces, my own expression fractured. I didn't understand why it unsettled me so much, but something about it felt like a warning I wasn't prepared to interpret. Maya approached my desk with a hesitance that made my stomach twist before she even spoke. She glanced over her shoulder twice as if checking whether anyone might overhear her. Her voice dropped to almost a whisper as she leaned in and said she needed to tell me something she should have told me yesterday. The way she clutched her coffee cup told me she'd rehearsed this moment, weighing the cost of saying it out loud. She told me she'd been walking near the break room doorway around 10:30 yesterday morning, right when the overhead vent was rattling in that uneven rhythm it always fell into before maintenance came by. She said she heard Mark talking to another co-worker, low enough that he thought no one else was nearby, but loud enough that she caught every word. He'd made a remark about my mother twisting the grief she knew I was still carrying into something he could smirk at. The words hit me harder than I knew they would. I felt them settle in my chest like a cold weight. I asked her what exactly he said, but she shook her head, her eyes tightening in apology. She said she didn't feel right repeating the exact phrasing, not because she wanted to protect him, but because the cruelty of it felt indecent to carry forward. She said it was unmistakably mocking, unmistakably about me, and unmistakably meant to get a reaction he could enjoy. I tried to hold on to my composure, but I could feel heat rising along the back of my neck. I kept my voice steady, asking how long she'd known he'd been doing this. She hesitated, and that hesitation told me everything before she spoke. She said she'd overheard similar comments before, smaller ones, colder ones, but she hadn't been sure if she'd misunderstood. Yesterday, though, there was no misunderstanding. It was deliberate. It was targeted. Something inside me pulled taut. as if the cracked reflection on my phone had split something inside me too, exposing a truth I had tried to ignore. I thanked her quietly, though the words felt too thin to carry what I meant. She apologized again, saying she didn't want to make things worse for me, but she couldn't keep pretending she hadn't heard anything. In her eyes, I saw a mixture of guilt and fear, the kind people carry when they've watched something wrong for too long. Mark passed by again a little too casually, his gaze sliding toward me with the faintest trace of curiosity. Not guilt, not concern. Curiosity, like he was gauging the aftermath of a stone he'd thrown into water. I looked at him long enough to make him turn away, and for once he didn't smirk. The absence of that smirk was somehow worse, like he didn't need the facade anymore. I sat at my desk trying to assemble my thoughts, but everything felt off balance. The hum of computers felt louder, the fluorescent lights harsher, the entire office too aware of itself. Maya returned to her desk quietly, leaving me with the truth lodged firmly in my chest. I looked down at my phone again, the cracked reflection waiting like a reminder of what had just shifted. I turned the screen face down, but the fracture lingered in my mind, a symbol of what couldn't be hidden anymore. It struck me then that Mark's cruelty had never been careless. It was measured, calculated, and waiting for the right moment to cut deeper. I tried to continue working, but the weight of what Maya said kept pressing into me, reshaping the day. The office felt different now, not hostile but alert, like everyone sensed a current running beneath the surface that no one wanted to touch. When the afternoon finally ended, I gathered my things slowly, my hands steady, only because I refused to let them shake. As I stood, the cracked reflection from earlier flickered through my mind one last time. I didn't know then how deep the fracture would become. The truth wouldn't stay quiet after that moment. The break room was louder than usual that morning, not with real conversation, but with the kind of forced chatter people use when they're trying to avoid acknowledging tension in the room. I walked in only because I needed a moment away from my desk, and I tried to convince myself that maybe the air in here would feel lighter. It didn't. The first thing I noticed was the glass ashtray sitting in the center of the break room table, an outdated leftover from a time when this floor allowed smoking years before I was hired. It didn't belong here anymore, but someone kept it around as a place to drop candy wrappers and loose paper clips. The way the light hit its chipped edges made the whole room feel sharper, as if the ashtray itself had been waiting for someone to make a mistake. I poured myself a cup of overbrewed coffee, hoping the bitterness would wake me up from the heaviness of what Maya had told me the day before. Several co-workers were there, pretending to talk about weekend errands, though their glances kept sliding toward the doorway, like they expected something unsettling to happen. Mark walked in, as if summoned by the collective dread, his stride loose, his presence immediately filling every inch of silence. He made a show of grabbing a mug from the cabinet, clinking it louder than necessary. I tried to ignore him, but ignoring Mark was like trying to ignore static always present, always prickling. He leaned against the counter, pretending to search for sugar he never used, and addressed the room instead of me when he said something about people who cling to grief, like it's a personality trait. The words were casual, tossed like scraps into the center of the room, but everyone knew exactly who he meant. The conversations around us died in uneven fragments. My heartbeat tightened. I felt the eyes of coworkers press into me, unsure whether to defend me or pretend they hadn't heard. Mark smirked as if he'd just told a harmless joke. I put the coffee down before I could spill it. He wasn't finished. He made another remark, quieter this time, but not quiet enough, about how some people in this office use personal tragedy for attention. The sound of that sentence scraped across my nerves like glass. I stared at the ashtray because looking at anything else felt too dangerous. The room shifted all at once, the air thickening, as everyone realized the cruelty wasn't an accident, it was a performance designed to humiliate me. One coworker dropped their spoon. Another stood frozen with the refrigerator door open. No one said a word. I could feel heat rising through my chest, the kind that comes when you're too stunned even to defend yourself. Mark glanced at me then just briefly, and the satisfaction in his eyes made the moment collapse inward. I walked out before my voice could betray me, not fast enough to look panicked, but fast enough that he knew he'd landed his hit. The hallway outside was colder than it should have been, every fluorescent light buzzing with an edge. I hadn't realized Darius had stepped out of his office until he appeared at the far end, watching the break room through the open doorway, as though he'd caught the tail end of something he couldn't quite name. He didn't say anything to me, not yet, but his eyes followed Mark when he walked out a moment later, looking smug and unconcerned. I could see the shift in Darius's expression, a sharpening like he was connecting threads I didn't know he'd been tracking. Hours later, after I'd settled into a numb rhythm at my desk, Darius approached quietly and asked me to step into his office. His tone was neutral, but the neutrality was too controlled to be casual. Inside, he closed the door halfway, not enough to feel secretive, but enough to feel intentional. He said he'd reviewed footage from the corridor camera near the break room earlier that morning, footage he regularly checks because of a recent string of minor thefts. He mentioned that the system automatically labeled the file with a timestamp and location ID. The way he said it, careful and precise, made me realize he was offering me more information than he was saying aloud. He told me the clip caught Mark standing close to the break room entrance at the exact time coworkers described hearing something unprofessional. He didn't repeat the words, didn't push me to confirm anything, but the implication sat heavily between us. I asked why he'd checked the footage. He said he'd noticed something off about Mark's demeanor when he walked past his office earlier, and something about the tension in the break room doorway made him curious enough to pull the file. That was when I realized I wasn't the only one who had felt the air shift. Darius wasn't guessing he was tracking. He said he couldn't make assumptions yet, but he wanted me to know he was paying attention. The ashtray image from that morning echoed in my mind, its fractured reflections turning the room's silence into something harder, darker. For the first time I saw the hint of someone in authority stepping between Mark's shadow and mine. I left Darius's office with my pulse still unsteady, the knowledge of the corridor clip following me like a second spine. It wasn't definitive proof, not yet, but it was enough to shake whatever confidence Mark thought he had. I returned to my desk, trying not to show the thin thread of relief tightening through my chest. Mark walked by soon after, more cautious in his expression now, as though sensing a shift he hadn't expected. He didn't smirk this time. He didn't have to. His silence revealed more. Something in the morning's light had changed him, even if he didn't know why yet. The ground under him had started to move. By the time the next morning settled into its dull rhythm, I had convinced myself that keeping my head down would somehow keep things manageable, but the quiet felt sharper than usual, as if the building itself was waiting for something to snap. The familiar hum of computers was steadier than my pulse. When Ryan gestured for me to come over, his expression carried a seriousness I wasn't used to seeing from him. The metallic shadow cast from the edge of his monitor stretched long across his desk, flickering gently with the shifting screen brightness, and for a moment it looked like the shadow was reaching toward me, urging me closer. Ryan rarely initiated conversation unless something was wrong. He tapped the side of his monitor, showing me a document I recognized, an internal status report Mark had supposedly filed the previous day. The ref code in the corner was correct, but the timestamp next to it made no sense. According to the system, the file had been updated at 9:12 a.m., but Mark had been in the break room making his comments around that time, witnessed by several people, and later partially confirmed by Darius's corridor clip. Ryan said the system logs didn't match Mark's claimed timeline. I felt the air around us tighten. A timestamp mismatch was more than a glitch. It was a fracture in the narrative Mark had been trying to build. Ryan clicked through a few windows, pulling up the system's event history. The ref code RS47B had two conflicting entries, one showing 9:12 a.m., the other listing an autosave at 9:41 a.m. The problem was that Mark had told the team he'd finalized the report before 9. Ryan wasn't accusing anyone outright, but the weight of his pause said enough. I stared at the metallic shadow on the desk and felt a cold realization forming. Mark wasn't just cruel. He was careless in ways that revealed the seams of his lies. The office around us continued moving in slow, predictable patterns, but my awareness sharpened into something more focused. I asked Ryan how often these timestamp inconsistencies happened. He shrugged, saying it wasn't common, but it wasn't unheard of either. Sometimes files auto-saved after someone reopened them, sometimes metadata failed to sync. But he hesitated before continuing. He said he'd only looked because Mark's behavior in the break room had drawn attention, and the inconsistency stood out once he checked the activity logs. The hesitation in his voice made it clear he'd been sitting on this for a while, debating whether pointing it out would entangle him in something he'd rather avoid. Mark walked by, then his footsteps louder than necessary, and Ryan minimized the screen reflexively. Mark looked at us with an expression so neutral it became hostile, his eyes shaded by the overhead lighting, just enough that I couldn't read what he was calculating. I felt a momentary urge to step back, even though he wasn't close enough to touch me. The metallic shadow twitched across Ryan's desk as the monitor dimmed, forming a distorted silhouette like a warning I couldn't ignore. Something in Mark's posture told me he sensed a shift, even if he didn't yet know its cause. When Mark turned away, Ryan reopened the windows and told me he'd save a copy of the mismatched timestamp entries in case things escalated. The way he said escalated made my stomach twist. I thanked him quietly, knowing he would prefer no public acknowledgement. He nodded once, then turned back to his work, as though nothing unusual had been discussed. I returned to my desk with the ref code repeating in my mind RS47B, along with the conflicting times. The information pressed into me like a bruise forming from the inside out. Mark wasn't just manipulating people. He was altering details that could be traced. The thought should have given me a sense of advantage, but instead it made me feel the weight of how far he might go. The rest of the morning passed in a strained haze. Co-workers moved with a cautious kind of silence, avoiding prolonged eye contact, avoiding proximity to Mark, avoiding the break room entirely. Even the air felt thick with the residue of yesterday's humiliation. I kept imagining the timestamp error as a crack running through a piece of glass, thin at first, then branching outward as more pressure is applied. Mark acted as though everything was normal, humming a tune under his breath, tapping his pen, laughing at messages on his phone. But beneath all of it there was a tension in his shoulders, a stiffness that didn't belong to someone in control. Around midday I stepped into the hallway to clear my head, and felt the atmosphere shift again. The lighting hummed with an uncomfortable frequency, and the shadows cast by the overhead fixtures seemed elongated, as though the building itself was stretching the truth into something visible. When I passed Mark on my way back from the restroom, he looked at me with an expression that hovered between suspicion and irritation, like he thought I knew something he hadn't meant for me to see. I held his gaze long enough to make him look away, and that small victory should have felt like something, but all it did was deepen the hollow behind my sternum. He walked off with clenched hands, a rhythm of agitation in his footsteps. For the first time since this began, I sensed an instability in him that looked a lot like fear. I tried to return to work, but nothing in the room felt steady. Even the metallic shadow lingering on Ryan's desk replayed in my memory, stretching and shifting with every thought. Late in the afternoon, I heard Mark laughing too loudly with a coworker, the forced tone signaling his need to reassert dominance in a place that was beginning to slip from his grip. It didn't work. Their responses were too soft, too uncertain. The power he relied on was eroding, and he didn't know why. When the day finally crawled to its end, I packed my things, slowly feeling the tension settle into something more defined. Beneath the surface of all this, the cracks in his story were widening. His version of events was no longer holding together. By the middle of the week, the tension in the office had become so thick it felt like walking through a room filled with barely cooled glass, fragile and ready to shatter at the slightest sound. I tried to keep myself steady, tried to look occupied, tried not to let the growing awareness of Mark's scrutiny tighten my shoulders every time he passed my desk. But even the rhythm of the day had begun to warp around him. Conversations paused when he entered a room, footsteps adjusted to avoid crossing his path, and the subtle hierarchy he'd once relied on no longer responded to him with the same obedient ease. I noticed it most clearly during a mid-morning briefing when Darius asked each of us to confirm availability for an upcoming client review. Mark answered too quickly, claiming he'd spent the previous afternoon finalizing the prep materials in Conference Room B. The statement sounded practiced, but not confident. Something about the way he said it made the hairs at the back of my neck lift. A few coworkers glanced toward him, subtle but suspicious, because his tone carried a defensive edge he tried to bury under casualness. The moment he finished speaking, the overhead lights flickered faintly, and the glare from his wristwatch hit the table with a sharp burst of reflected light. The sudden flash drew my attention instinctively, and I saw something odd in the way the glare cut across his hands and face, splitting the shadow of his jaw into two uneven lines. It echoed an image I didn't want to remember, the one that had been haunting me since all this began. As the glare trembled, cutting the light into two separate beams across the surface of the table, the moment clicked into clarity. The same shadow splits again, sharper this time. It was as if the motif itself had risen into the room, surfacing in the exact second his lie cracked open. Later, while reviewing scheduling notes, Darius asked Mark to clarify the time he'd been in Conference Room B. Mark stiffened slightly and named a window between 3:15 and 4:00 p.m. The words left his mouth too fast, too certain, too tidy. The problem was simple and immediate. At 3:17, the system had logged his file access in the shared drive, something he should not have been able to do from the conference room where the terminal wasn't connected to the internal editing server. That access would come up later, but even without it, I remembered seeing him in the hallway around that time, pacing with restless energy, nowhere near Conference Room B. Time has a way of exposing liars, because it refuses to adjust itself to the stories they prefer. Darius didn't challenge him yet, but the way his expression tightened told me he noticed the missing minute, the gap in Mark's story that he couldn't account for. The contradiction slid into place like a cold coin dropped into the palm of my hand. Mark continued speaking, unaware of how much he'd revealed by trying to control the narrative too tightly. His voice wavered almost imperceptibly each time he tried to anchor his claim to a specific moment. I found myself staring again at the faint glare trembling off his wristwatch, the way it flickered each time he shifted in his seat, as though the light itself rejected his version of events. The more he insisted on his timeline, the more obvious it became that he was building it out of desperation rather than truth. At one point, Mark glanced in my direction, perhaps sensing that something in the room had turned toward him. His eyes flicked downward before meeting mine, and for a second I saw fear buried under irritation, a fear he wasn't practiced at hiding because he wasn't used to needing to. I didn't look away. I wanted him to see that I recognized the fracture he'd created in his story, that I was no longer pretending not to notice. He redirected his attention, quickly shifting in his seat, making the wristwatch glare flash again across the conference table like a blade of light cutting through thin fog. The rest of the meeting moved slowly, tense and off balance, everyone careful not to place themselves too close to the conflict forming between Mark's narrative and reality. Afterward, as people filtered out, Ryan lingered by the door watching Mark with a guarded expression. His look wasn't accusatory, it was observational, calculating, as if he'd already cross-referenced Mark's timeline with the system logs in his memory. Maya avoided the room entirely, disappearing the moment the meeting ended. I took the long way back to my desk, needing space to reassemble my thoughts. In the hallway, the lights cast uneven stripes across the floor. For a moment, the wristwatch glare replayed in my mind that sharp division of light that had mirrored the split in Mark's certainty. I felt something shift inside me, not relief and not triumph, but a clarity that I had been starving for. The truth was no longer abstract. It was taking form piece by piece, each contradiction revealing the seams of his facade. I sat at my desk and let the tension ripple through me, steadying myself against the knowledge of how far this was going to go. Mark walked by a few minutes later, his posture more rigid than usual, his expression tight controlled. He avoided looking at me this time, but his jaw clenched in a way that betrayed the pressure he'd begun to feel. I watched him long enough to see the exact moment he realized he'd overplayed his confidence. In his avoidance, I saw the first real crack in his ability to manipulate the space around him. The office felt different afterward, quieter, but charged, as if everyone sensed the shift, even if no one could name it. Something about the way Mark moved told me he knew the ground had started to shift beneath him, whether he admitted it or not. When the day ended, the wristwatch glare still hung in my mind, a bright wound of light that revealed every contour of his lie. The cracks in him were becoming impossible to hide. By Thursday, the atmosphere in the office had shifted from tense to brittle, as if every conversation risked snapping under the pressure of whatever truth was trying to surface. I felt it the moment I stepped in quiet pockets of coworkers huddled near doorways, people lowering their voices mid-sentence, glances darting toward Mark, with a mixture of unease and restrained curiosity. Even the hum of the HVAC sounded uneven, carrying the faint metallic rattle that always came before the vents cycled off. At my desk, I noticed the drawer beside me had been left half open overnight, a thin gap revealing the corner of a forgotten folder. The half-open drawer felt like a metaphor for the entire floor, nothing fully hidden anymore, everything slightly exposed. I didn't touch it. Not yet. I needed my head clear. The morning moved slowly until I overheard two design team members whispering in the hallway near the 7th floor elevator. They weren't being dramatic, just careful. One of them said he'd heard Mark say something messed up again earlier in the week. Something directed at me, and the other muttered that he'd been right there when it happened, near the East Side Printer Bay, and that it was definitely about her. They didn't repeat the words exactly, but their tones said enough. The floor location, the paraphrase of what they heard, it all slipped into place without them knowing how closely I was listening. Their unease was palpable. They lowered their voices when Mark walked past his steps, clipped and impatient, as though he felt the building murmuring against him. I retreated into the break area, just as Maya approached me, her hands clasped tight around a water bottle. She said co-workers weren't just noticing Mark's behavior, they were starting to talk to Darius. She didn't name names, but the implication was clear. The office had begun to shift. Mark wasn't the center of gravity anymore. His influence had thinned, cracked, and was starting to leak out into conversations he couldn't control. He moved differently now, too. Quicker, sharper. He scanned the room every time he entered it. He hadn't lost his arrogance, but something brittle had formed under it, a tension he couldn't mask. His smile was stretched thin, a veneer barely covering frustration. I returned to my desk and stared at the half-open drawer again. I nudged it a fraction of an inch, watching the light change along its edge, and something about that small motion sent a strange clarity through me. Secrets don't stay buried. They slide into visibility inch by inch until someone can no longer ignore the gap. Around lunchtime, the office tension spiked when Mark raised his voice near the design hub, his frustration boiling over in a way that startled even those who'd defended him before. He was arguing with someone about a missed deadline, but the anger felt misdirected, too intense, too desperate, like he was fighting a battle only he understood. People stepped back instinctively, leaving space around him, a subtle shape of isolation he seemed to recognize too late. Darius emerged from his office not with irritation, but with heightened attention, the kind of focused stillness he used when he was gathering information. He didn't confront Mark. He didn't need to. Observing was enough. Mark caught me watching from across the room and glared, but there was something different beneath the glare, uncertainty flickering under the surface. He opened his mouth like he wanted to say something to challenge me, dismiss me, cut me down in front of everyone. But for the first time since I'd known him, he chose silence instead. And that silence said more about his fear than any insult ever could. Later in the afternoon, Ryan slid by my desk and whispered that several people had gone to Darius, mentioning what they'd overheard days earlier. They hadn't quoted Mark exactly, but they'd described his tone, his phrasing, the way he lingered near the break room doorway before making the comments. Their statements lined up with each other, forming an informal constellation of truth that didn't need perfect wording to be understood. Ryan said one co-worker from the East Side Printer Bay confirmed hearing something too, again not verbatim, but clearly about my mother. I felt the air press inward, heavy but validating. These weren't isolated incidents or private suspicions. People had heard him. People remembered. People were finally willing to say so. In that moment I realized the silence protecting Mark had begun to dissolve, replaced by a shared acknowledgement that his cruelty had gone too far. When Mark reappeared later that day, he moved like someone expecting attack from every direction, his shoulders tense, his jaw tight, his voice thinner than before. He walked past Darius's office without looking inside, a habit he had never changed until now. It was as if he feared what the quiet might reveal about him. Darius, meanwhile, seemed to be everywhere at once, appearing in hallways, pausing near conversations, observing without inserting himself. The calmness of his presence contrasted sharply with the agitation radiating from Mark, and co-workers noticed. They weren't avoiding Mark because they feared him anymore. They were avoiding him because he no longer controlled the narrative. I returned to my desk near closing time and saw the half-open drawer again, the small gap now filled with the dim amber of the late afternoon light. Something had shifted inside me, too. A recognition that the balance of power on this floor was no longer his to command. What had been hidden was edging into plain sight. Even if Mark refused to confront it, the people around him were beginning to. The drawer creaked a fraction wider when I brushed past it, as if exhaling a secret it had been holding. Mini hook. The floor had stopped bending around him and begun to push back. By Friday afternoon, the air in the office felt like it was holding its breath, stretched thin between what people suspected and what no one had said aloud yet. Even the hum of the overhead vents was softer, like the building itself was bracing. I felt it most clearly when Darius asked me to step into his office, his voice calm but not neutral, and the long hallway to his door seemed to sharpen with every step I took. When I entered, the room was lit only by a dim lamp in the corner, its uneven glow pooling across the desk in a soft amber that made the rest of the office seem distant. Darius didn't gesture for me to sit right away. He waited, studying me with that steady, measured calm he used when something significant had shifted. When he finally motioned toward the chair, the dim lamp cast a long shadow across his arm, the light bending as if reluctant to reveal what he was about to say. He opened a file on his desk, a printed copy of an email chain, and told me he had found something disturbing when reviewing HR correspondence related to previous concerns raised on this floor. His voice stayed even, but the lamp's glow deepened the lines around his eyes. He slid the papers toward me, not dramatically, but with the weight of something decisive. The top email was one I recognized from months ago, from when I'd tried to express discomfort about Mark's behavior in an early, tentative way that didn't feel like a complaint so much as a plea for clarity. I'd never received a real response, just a vague acknowledgement I'd assumed was HR backlog. Now, seeing the printed thread, I noticed something wrong immediately. The subject line reference didn't match the version I remembered. It read, "Follow-up on internal conduct note, revised." But I had never sent anything with that title. And beneath it, the timestamp was dated nearly 4 weeks after the day I originally submitted the concern, long after I'd given up hoping anyone would address it. Darius watched my face closely. The mismatch wasn't subtle. It was glaring, the kind of error that could only come from someone altering or resubmitting the thread. He told me he'd verified the metadata, and according to the system, the message had been updated by someone with elevated access. Not HR, not him. Another administrator one Mark had befriended early in his tenure here. My heart tightened. The pieces aligned too cleanly. The unanswered concern, the missing follow-up, the sudden shift in tone when Mark realized people had started watching him more closely. It all pointed back to a manipulation I never imagined he'd attempt. The dim lamp flickered slightly, making the timestamp blur for a second, as if the truth itself pulsed with the weight of being seen at last. I tried to speak, but the words tangled in my throat. I felt the heaviness of what this meant. Not just that Mark mocked my grief or lied about his whereabouts, but that he'd interfered with a formal process that was meant to protect me. The realization hit with a clarity so sharp it felt like the floor had tilted under my feet. Darius leaned back, hands folded, expression tight with controlled anger. He said he wasn't sure how deep the interference went, but the altered timestamp proved someone had tampered with the chain. He'd already checked the server logs. The original entry date was intact, but buried behind the revised version. Whoever updated it had tried to rewrite the timeline so the concern appeared far less urgent so it could be dismissed. I could tell Darius had spent hours with this discovery, piecing together the implications. He wasn't guessing. He was certain. He asked if I remembered sending anything else around that time, any follow-up, any resubmission. I shook my head. I had sent only one message, the original one. The rest was fabricated. It was hard to breathe for a moment. I tried to anchor myself in the dim glow of the lamp, but even the steady circle of light felt unstable. No wonder nothing had been done. No wonder HR had never followed up. Mark hadn't just made comments, he'd helped hide them, or at least benefited from someone who had. I kept thinking about the half-open drawer from yesterday, the sense of secrets sliding into visibility. This was bigger than whispers and timelines. This was institutional distortion. Darius spoke softly, but every word carried weight. He said he'd already taken the altered email to HR management. He said they were concerned, which I recognized as corporate language for alarm. He said there would be inquiries. The tone in his voice told me he was preparing for confrontation, not conversation. For the first time since this began, I saw in him not just authority, but conviction, an unwavering resolve to bring the truth into clean light. Mark must have sensed something happening because I heard his voice outside the office, a sharp, agitated tone that didn't fit the careful confidence he usually displayed. He paced the hallway, muttering something about overreactions and people twisting things, but his words carried a tremor he couldn't hide. Darius heard it too. His jaw flexed almost imperceptibly before he turned back to me and said he would handle whatever came next. But I needed to be prepared. The truth was going to surface fast now. I nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of the moment. The room felt smaller than before, tighter, as if the dim lamp had drawn all the shadows inward to force the truth into the center. I stood to leave but paused at the door. Something about the altered email, the false timestamp, the manipulation, it all settled into a realization that the lies Mark depended on weren't just cracking. They were collapsing. As I stepped into the hallway, the dim lamp's glow followed me like a final signal of the shift. His protections were starting to crumble in plain sight. The next morning the office felt strangely hollow, as if everyone inside it had begun speaking in half-finished thoughts that never quite reached the air. I moved through the space quietly, feeling the weight of yesterday's revelation in every step, the altered HR email still echoing through my mind. When I reached my desk, I noticed a small receipt slip lying half-tucked under my keyboard, one of those thin paper fragments left behind from supply orders or coffee runs. I didn't think much of it until I picked it up and saw a faint smear of ink along the edge, as though someone had handled it with an unsteady grip. I set it aside, not knowing yet that it would tether itself to the rest of the morning. Ryan appeared beside me a few minutes later, his movements sharp with urgency, though his voice stayed low. He told me he'd checked the system logs again, not because he was digging for trouble, but because the inconsistency from earlier in the week had bothered him more than he expected. He clicked open a window on his tablet, positioned it so only I could see, and pointed to a single line in the access history. It listed a log ID L39214B and an access time of 3:17 p.m., but the entry wasn't for a shared team file like before. It was linked to a restricted notes folder, one that held HR references and administrative drafts records. Mark shouldn't have had any reason or any permission to open. The timestamp hit me immediately because it contradicted his claim from Part 6 that he'd been in Conference Room B from 3:15 to 4:00 finalizing prep materials. There was no plausible overlap. He couldn't have accessed the system from that room. Ryan didn't say that aloud, but he didn't need to. The time and log ID said enough. My pulse tightened as the realization took form. Mark hadn't just manipulated documents. He was accessing files connected to HR communications. The breath I took afterward felt shallow. I stared at the tablet screen and felt dread coil tightly in my chest. Ryan said he wasn't sure whether the access had been authorized, but the log listed Mark's username clear as day. He glanced around, cautious as ever, lowering the brightness of the screen as a few coworkers passed. He told me he'd saved a copy of the entry in case it was altered later. His voice wasn't angry, just quietly resolute, and for the first time I saw in him the same urgency I had seen in Darius. People were no longer watching passively. They were gathering truth. The receipt slip on my desk seemed to stare back at me now, an odd echo of the system log, a thin paper fragment hinting at something larger, a reminder that even small traces can become anchors for bigger revelations. What terrified me most was not the log entry itself, but how easily Mark had slipped into places he didn't belong, shaping narratives behind closed doors. Mark entered the workspace not long after, and the shift in energy was immediate. His eyes scanned the room, searching for footholds of familiarity, but the people around him avoided his gaze with a subtlety that felt intentional. He tried initiating small talk with a designer near the window, but she nodded without interest and walked away. The distance carved itself deeper. When his eyes landed on me, they lingered too long, questioning, calculating. I could feel him reading my posture, my stillness, the tension in my hands. He didn't know what I'd learned, but he knew the balance was changing again. He approached my desk, leaning one hand against the divider as if asserting space. His voice was low, controlled, but unsteady at the edges. He asked if everything was okay, the kind of question he'd never asked before, and certainly not in that tone. I answered with a simple yes, not because it was true, but because any real answer would have given him more than I wanted him to have. He looked down at the receipt slip on my desk, and something in his expression tightened, not recognition but fear of the unknown. He straightened as if preparing for confrontation, but before he could say anything else, Darius's door opened and the sound cut through the tension like a blade. Darius stepped out with an expression that didn't need explanation. Calm, focused, decisive. Mark froze in place, his knuckles whitening on the desk divider. Then he stepped back quickly like a man retreating from heat. The rest of the day unfolded slowly, steeped in a strained quiet that grew heavier each hour. I spent most of it trying to decide whether I was ready to reveal the voicemail recording the audio I had kept hidden even from myself, the one in which Mark's imitation of my mother's hospice voice still rang like a wound I couldn't bear to replay. The weight of that decision lived in every breath I took. I didn't know if sharing it was strength or surrender. Grief complicates clarity like nothing else. I went to the break area to clear my mind, and the lights felt dimmer than usual, the air colder. The receipt slip was still in my hand, and I folded it once, then again, as if pressing it into something small enough to understand. Evidence built around me in quiet accumulations, each piece adding to the pressure, each contradiction carving away Mark's version of events. I realized the truth wasn't waiting to emerge, it was demanding to be acknowledged, and my silence was no longer protecting me. As I left the room, I passed Mark in the hallway. He wasn't angry this time, he was afraid, not of me, but of the shapeless truth building around him, closing in from angles he couldn't predict. The day crawled toward its end, the tension coiling tighter, the decision inside me settling into something nearly solid. When the final hour approached, I slipped the receipt into my pocket, feeling the thin paper crinkle under my fingertips, like a reminder that small details could topple the entire architecture of his lies. I knew tomorrow would demand more than silence. I knew the day was different the moment I walked into the office and saw Darius standing outside his door. Arms folded, expression sharpened to a level of calm that felt almost surgical. People moved around him with the kind of wariness reserved for moments when truth becomes unavoidable. I felt the weight of the receipt slip in my pocket, but it wasn't the paper that made my hands shake. It was the decision I had made the night before, a decision that had kept me awake long after midnight. When Darius asked me to join him in the small conference room at the end of the hall, his tone left no room for misinterpretation. Inside the blinds were half-drawn, slicing the room into uneven bands of light. On the table lay a single item, a small black USB recorder, its surface scratched from years of being tossed into drawers. Next to it was the trembling key I had used to unlock my mother's keepsake box the night before, still shaking faintly between my fingers. Darius nodded toward the recorder, waiting for me to confirm what he already sensed. I set the key down gently beside it and told him yes, that the audio he was about to hear was real, and that I couldn't keep it buried anymore. I felt my breath tremble as I explained how the recording had been saved automatically on my phone months ago when my mother's hospice nurse left a voicemail. Mark had overheard me replaying it quietly during lunch one day, back when my grief was still raw and fragile. And later in the break room, he had imitated my mother's fading voice, soft, strained, unbearably tender, turning it into a joke. I hadn't been able to delete it or listen to it again, but I also couldn't unhear it. Last night, after everything surrounding the altered HR email and the system logs, I had finally transferred it to the recorder. As I spoke, Darius's expression tightened, not with surprise, but with something colder, something that looked like resolve crystallizing. I pressed play. The audio clicked, followed by a faint static hum, and then the metadata tag, VM Hospice 03 recorded 2:14 p.m. The timestamp landed with a heaviness that made the room feel smaller. Then my mother's real voice came through, gentle and tired, a sound I hadn't let myself touch since the week she passed. It ached to hear it. And then Mark's imitation followed, layered in behind her like a cruel shadow, his voice mimicking her fragile tone, bending it into a mockery so sharp it made my ribs tighten. Darius closed his eyes just for a heartbeat, absorbing the impact. Hearing the cruelty out loud stripped away every doubt, leaving only truth that could not be softened or rationalized. He let the recording play in full, not stopping it, even when my breath cracked. When it ended, he reached forward and turned off the device carefully, as if handling something dangerous. He said this changed everything. His voice was low, steady, but beneath it ran an unmistakable current of controlled fury. He asked when I had first heard Mark imitate the recording. I told him the approximate week, the place, the break room door frame with the humming vending machine beside it, and how I had frozen, unable to understand how grief could be twisted into entertainment for him. Darius asked if anyone else had been nearby. I wasn't sure. The moment had carved itself so sharply into my memory that everything else around it blurred. Mark's voice had been too soft for a crowd, but too deliberate to be accidental. The trembling key shimmered slightly on the table each time my hand brushed near it, catching the cut light from the blinds. It felt symbolic, the truth finally unlocking itself, whether I was ready or not. Darius stood, paced, once composed himself, and said he needed to speak with Mark immediately. He walked to the door but paused, turning back to me with a look that carried both apology and certainty. He said he wished I hadn't had to carry this alone. The words weren't meant to comfort, but they did something inside me anyway, like placing a hand over a wound to keep it from reopening. Mark entered the room moments later, summoned by Darius's clipped tone. His expression shifted the instant he saw us, surprise, then calculation, then an attempt at confidence that didn't quite land. Darius gestured for him to sit. Mark stayed standing. His jaw tightened. His eyes flicked to the recorder, then to the trembling key, and something in his posture faltered. Darius began by asking him to confirm where he had been several months ago, on the day I received a particular voicemail. Mark blinked slowly, searching for a safe answer, settling on vague recollection. Darius didn't press. It wasn't needed. He pressed play instead. The room changed temperature the moment Mark's imitation voice filled the space. His face blanched in a way that stripped him of every ounce of bravado he ever wore. He opened his mouth to deny it, but even he knew the sound was unmistakable. His cadence, his tone, his cruelty captured in a moment he never imagined would follow him. Watching him hear his own voice laid bare was the closest thing to justice I had ever felt in real time. He stuttered, insisting it was a misunderstanding, a joke taken out of context, but the lie collapsed the moment it left his mouth. Darius didn't respond to the excuse. His silence was sharper than any rebuttal. Mark tried again, grasping for words, searching for anything that could soften the weight of what had been revealed. There was nothing. The truth had locked him in place. The trembling key caught the light again as I reached for it on instinct, anchoring myself as the final blow landed. Darius dismissed him with a measured tone that left no ambiguity. There would be consequences, formal and immediate. Mark backed toward the door like a man walking through debris he had once thought indestructible. He didn't look at me. He didn't dare. When the door closed behind him, the room felt unbearably quiet. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. The moment had broken something in him that wouldn't mend. The hallway outside Darius's conference room felt unnaturally silent after Mark stumbled out his steps uneven, his face drained of every scrap of composure he had once worn like armor. I watched him from the corner of my eye as he tried to steady himself, one hand gripping the wall, the other clutching his folded jacket so tightly the fabric strained at the seams. For someone who thrived on dominance, he looked suddenly small, reduced, as though the truth had stripped him down to bone. I stepped into the hall just as he attempted to gather himself, and he flinched when he realized I was there. The folded jacket slipped slightly in his grasp, the edge dragging against the floor before he yanked it back up. His eyes darted across the hallway, searching for an audience, for rescuers, for anyone who might restore the balance he had lost. But the office had shifted. People kept their distance, reluctant to even breathe near him. The confidence he always carried had evaporated, replaced with a frantic twitch beneath the surface, like he was trying to patch holes in a sinking ship. I didn't speak. I didn't have to. My silence seemed to unnerve him more than any confrontation could. He tried to swallow whatever words had risen in his throat, but they tangled there, visible in the strain of his jaw, the tightening of his grip on the jacket. Seeing him unravel in real time felt surreal, as if the version of Mark who once commanded rooms had never truly existed. He muttered something about misinterpretations and politics, his voice pitched low but shaky. Each attempt to frame himself as a victim collapsed under its own weight. He glanced toward Darius's office, where the blinds still cast thin stripes of light, and a shiver ran through him. He wasn't afraid of me. He was afraid of the truth recorded in that room. When he finally looked directly at me, there was a flicker of something I had never seen in his expression before. Recognition, almost apology, but corrupted by the panic twisting beneath it. He opened his mouth again, but the sentence fractured halfway through. He couldn't form the lie cleanly anymore, not after hearing his own voice mimic the dying breaths of my mother. I felt a tremor rise in my chest, not anger, not vindication, but something quieter, deeper, like a grief rearranging itself after years of being mishandled. I walked past him slowly, and he instinctively stepped back, pulling the folded jacket against him as though shielding himself from something intangible. Behind me, I could hear his breathing grow jagged. The rest of the office moved in small, careful motions, pretending not to watch while watching everything. Mark hovered near the corner of the hallway, glancing at each doorway as if expecting someone else to emerge with another piece of truth. He wasn't wrong to fear it. Darius eventually stepped out of the conference room, his expression unreadable but decisive, and instructed Mark to gather his things. There would be a formal meeting later that day, HR present, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Mark nodded stiffly, still clutching the jacket, but his legs didn't move at first. It took him several seconds to take a step, and when he did, it was toward the wrong direction, a sign of disorientation so striking that even the most detached co-workers stiffened in surprise. He corrected himself quickly, but nothing about him looked composed. As he passed my desk, he spoke without turning his head, voice thin and uneven. He said he never meant it, and that he'd been under pressure, and that people twisted things. But every word trembled, hollowing itself out under the weight of what he had done. It was the first time I had ever seen a man try to stand inside a lie that had already collapsed around him. I didn't respond. My silence was not refusal, it was truth. Truth he could no longer bend, no matter how desperately he tried. Darius watched him gather his belongings, the folded jacket always held close like a fragile shield. He didn't interrupt, didn't expedite, didn't soften the inevitability settling over the room. When Mark finally zipped his bag, he hesitated, staring at his desk as if trying to imprint it in his memory, knowing he wouldn't see it again after today. His hands shook as he pulled the folded jacket under his arm. The fabric fluttered slightly, betraying the last ounce of his pretense. He walked toward the exit, and as he did, the office parted not out of courtesy, but instinct. People gave him space the same way one steps aside from a fallen structure, careful not to touch the debris. I followed at a distance, unsure if I wanted to see the moment he stepped through the door. But something compelled me, something quiet but insistent, a need to acknowledge the final turn in the story he had written with cruelty. Mark stopped at the glass entrance, his reflection flickering in the faint morning glare. For a moment, he looked as though he might turn back, say something, reclaim something, but the folded jacket in his arms tightened again, and he stepped forward without a word. The door clicked shut behind him. I stood still, letting the moment settle into me. It wasn't victory. It wasn't closure. It was the release of something that had been wrapped too tightly for too long, loosening, but not yet healed. Tomorrow would decide what his downfall meant for the rest of us. The office feels different now, and it's not just because his desk is empty. It's the way the light behaves steady where it used to tremble, as if the building itself has exhaled after holding its breath for too long. I stand under the same flickering bulb from that first night, but today it doesn't flicker. It hums with an even glow, casting one clean band of light across the hallway instead of fractured stripes. The silence here doesn't feel hostile anymore. It feels earned, like the pause after a verdict that finally matches the crime. People move more freely, conversations don't die the moment I enter a room, and the air doesn't crackle with unspoken tension. On my desk sits a slim stack of papers, from HR printed copies of updated policies and a formal acknowledgement of what happened. I pick up the top page, and the edge slides against my fingertip sharper than I expect. I wince as the paper edge cuts into my skin, a thin red line blooming along the pad of my finger, small but undeniable. I watch the blood bead there, and think about how many invisible cuts I've carried in this place, how many times the hurt was easy to dismiss because it didn't leave a mark anyone else could see. This one is different. This one is visible. I press my thumb against the paper for a second, steadying myself, then set it down and let the sting anchor me to the present. A few co-workers glance over, not with pity, but with a kind of quiet solidarity that would have been unthinkable weeks ago. They know more now about him, about me, about the way silence can be used as both shield and weapon. They don't treat me like I'm fragile anymore. They treat me like someone who survived something they finally recognize. I walk toward the hallway where everything started, where his whisper used to hang over the air like a stain and pause beneath the bulb as its steady light washes over me. For the first time since my mother's death, I feel grief without humiliation wrapped around it. The hallway floor is the same, the walls are the same, but my place inside this space has shifted. There is no longer a shadow leaning over my shoulder, waiting to twist my pain into entertainment. No one stands too close. No one whispers my loss back at me in a voice that doesn't belong to it. Instead, there is distance where there should be, and respect where there was none. Darius passes by with a quick nod, the kind that acknowledges both what happened and the fact that we're moving forward. He doesn't hover or pry or rehearse sympathy. His presence is steady like the light. The investigation has moved beyond our floor now. Decisions have been made, written into policy and consequence. Mark is gone. There are files documenting why, and this time no one can alter the dates or rewrite the subject lines to bury the truth. I think about my mother's voice, the real one, not the imitation he performed in front of the break room. I remember the way her breath would catch on certain words, how even in her weakest moments she tried to sound reassuring, how she never once turned my pain into something for herself. Losing her felt like losing the only person who knew how to hold my softness without turning it into a weakness. His mockery had taken the last sanctuary I had left and tried to stain it. But the recording didn't stay in the dark. It was heard, believed, acted on. That doesn't erase what he did, but it breaks the pattern that let people like him thrive. The shadow finally breaks into one clean line. I see it in the hallway now, a single stripe of light falling across the floor instead of the fractured doubled image that haunted me before. It doesn't split me into versions of myself anymore, the quiet one who endured and the silent one who carried everything alone. There's just me standing here in one piece. I think about the people who chose to speak Maya with her hesitant confession, Ryan, with his quiet investigation, the co-workers who finally admitted what they'd heard. None of them could undo what happened, but together they pulled the truth into the open where it could be seen and named and answered. I used to believe that staying small and still was the safest way to survive other people's cruelty, that if I didn't react, it would eventually lose interest and move on. But cruelty doesn't drift away on its own. It grows until it's forced to stop. I don't feel triumphant. That's not what this is. What I feel is something simpler, heavier, and more stable. The confirmation that what happened to me was real and wrong and not mine to carry alone anymore. I walk back to my desk, press a tissue against the paper cut until the bleeding slows, and slide the HR documents into a folder. They aren't trophies. They're a record one that won't be altered this time. The office hums around me, ordinary in a way that feels almost strange. It's not perfect. Offices never are. But the worst of the rot has been torn out of the foundation, and for now that's enough. I sit open a new email, and for the first time in a long time, my hands don't shake on the keyboard. I'm still here, and he no longer gets to decide what that means. I leave the building under a light that finally stays whole,